Hi guys, today in this video we will make a simple revision about section 4.6, which is fermentation process. Firstly, what is the meaning of fermentation process? Fermentation process is an anaerobic process that allow glycolysis process to continue. So this process doesn't require oxygen. So this process takes place inside cytoplasm. So fermentation, glycolysis, both of them occurs inside or takes place inside cytoplasm. Okay, we know that, pay attention, glucose splitting inside cytoplasm. The primary product of ATP, they're number 4, but the final 2 ATP and the glucose, the one molecule of glucose is splitting into 2 pyruvate molecules. So how the production for ATP will be 2 produced from glycolysis as a final product, but 2 still remains in this process to splitting other glucose, as we know that during glycolysis process we used 2 ATP for splitting of glucose. This 2 ATP comes from the same process. So for ATP to get out and to still to split other molecules of glucose. Okay. Let me ask you a question. Suppose that glycolysis process has been an molecule of glucose has been split in one of your muscles. One molecule of glucose split in one of your muscles, but oxygen is unavailable. So what will happen? Firstly, the glycolysis stop, which means no complete of the cell respiration, no oxygen. So this process not pass to the mitochondria to complete the cell respiration. So we know that cells needed energy, especially the muscle cells. The muscle cells required more amount of energy. So what will the cell do to produce ATP after stopping of glycolysis? After stopping of glycolysis due to unavailability of oxygen, process called lactic acid fermentation takes place to complete or allow glycolysis process to continue. So fermentation allow glycolysis to continue, and this type of lactic acid fermentation occurs inside especially the muscle cells. So fermentation allow glycolysis to continue for the production of ATP. So when I ask you fermentation or lactic acid fermentation sharing in the production of how many number of ATP, you will say 2 ATP, because it allows glycolysis to continue, and we know that glycolysis process produced 2 ATP molecules. And this is a question. When I ask you, suppose that a molecule of glucose has been split in one of your muscle cells, but oxygen is unavailable, so what will happen? You say that you will say glycolysis will stop and process of lactic acid fermentation takes place. Okay, let's talk about the lactic acid fermentation. You must know that lactic acid fermentation occurs in cells of vertebrates. Vertebrates, they are living organisms which have vertebral columns, and some of microorganism cells, lactic acid fermentation takes place in their cells. We have two examples in your curriculum about the fermentation. We have the first example, lactic acid fermentation, alcoholic fermentation. The most example, or the most common example about lactic acid, the muscle cell, and alcoholic like yeast fungus. But you must know that the two processes of lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation, both of them similar in their reactants. So what happened during lactic acid fermentation? We know that glycolysis occurs by splitting glucose, and the product will be 2-pyruvate and 2-NADH. Fermentation used this 2-NADH to convert this 2-pyruvate into lactic acid. So we can say that fermentation process used the materials which produced from glycolysis, and these materials are pyruvate and NADH, two molecules of NADH. So next point, how fermentation use these materials. The molecules 2-NADH, this one, convert pyruvate into lactic acid and change into NAD+. NADH means already this molecule carry electrons, but NAD have positive charge, means this molecule ready for carrying electrons, which means these molecules have the ability to enter the process of glycolysis. Okay, so we said that the most common example about lactic acid fermentation is in muscle cells. As a result of absence of oxygen in muscle cell during glycolysis, lactic acid fermentation takes place. As a result of accumulation of lactic acid, accumulation means more lactic acid inside the muscle. It causes the cramps. You heard that the athletes have cramps in their muscles. This results from accumulation of lactic acid. So when I ask you why you continue to breathe hard for several minutes after you stop exercising. Excellent. You breathe hard to obtain more oxygen. Good. To obtain more oxygen for what? There is more accumulation of lactic acid. You want to remove the lactic acid to recover the muscle. So obtain more oxygen for breaking and removed lactic acid. So this point show the role of fermentation. We said that fermentation uses the two molecule of 2-NADH to convert pyruvate into lactic acid, and still 2NAD. After converting the 2NADH change into 2NAD. This 2NAD required for glycolysis process, because we know that the process of glycolysis needs pick up electrons, molecule pick up electrons, and we know that NAD and FAD are pick up of electrons. So fermentation supply glycolysis process by 2NAD to continue. And once oxygen is available again, the cells return to using cellular respiration because oxygen is available. Last point about the alcoholic fermentation. You must know that alcoholic fermentation takes place, for example, in yeast fungus, and this yeast fungus used to making bread. Why? The bakers put yeast during making bread. Alcoholic fermentation produce CO2. So by using yeast fungus, alcoholic fermentation occurs, so production of CO2. The CO2 important for making bread because it makes the bread rise. So this process produce as a waste product carbon dioxide as a waste product. This carbon dioxide makes the bread rise up. So if we want to figure fermentation process, two types, lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation, in same figure. Both of them used pyruvate. I said that they are similar in the reactants, so both of them used pyruvate and NADH. But using 2NADH, okay, and convert pyruvate by using 2NADH and form of lactic acid, this represents lactic acid fermentation. But using 2NADH to convert pyruvate into 2-alcohol and produce CO2, 2 molecules of CO2 as waste product is considered alcoholic fermentation. So the similar between lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation is the reactants. Both of them used pyruvate and 2NADH to convert pyruvate. To convert pyruvate to lactic acid represent lactic acid formation. To convert pyruvate into 2-alcohol and 2 molecules of CO2 produced represent alcoholic fermentation. Thank you.